All right, before we go into our topic tonight, which is looking at the resurrection, let's look at just the historicity of Jesus himself, and then the resurrection, and how we know that that is an actual event that happened. Is it a blind faith thing, or is there anything behind it to believe such a thing? So that's where we're going tonight, but before we do, I just want to spend just a couple minutes just brushing over a little bit of where both kind of the foundation of this type of evidential conversations and a little bit of what we talked on last week. So it's really quick. I mentioned last week that the idea that we all have faith in something. Everyone does. Doesn't matter, right? If you're in an organized religion, a Christian, Muslim, Jewish kind of thing, you could just somebody who thinks there's something greater out there, spiritual, the force, right? Fates, the universe, God is in everything, or they're just, you don't believe in God at all. It all requires faith. It requires faith in things that you can't see and can't touch and can't prove. That's why I think of those categories, atheist is the most surprising, because some people would say, well, that's not a personal faith. Well, yes, it is. They're still believing in things that you can't go and see, you can't prove, you can't go to the beginning of the universe, you can't show when things happen, you can't show how they happen. It takes faith to believe that there is no God. That's a faithful thing. So everybody has faith. Everybody has a belief, and the question then just becomes whether there is evidence behind it, right? Because these things are all competing beliefs. And so why one over the other? Or are they all just thrown up in the air and it doesn't matter? Or is there some evidential reasons why one maybe doesn't seem to have as much evidential things behind it, or another one does? And when talking about these things, we were looking at historical evidence and logical and philosophical reasoning. And some of it is observation, right? It is looking at how the world works, how we see things, how we see reality. It's what seems to best describe everything we see and what we know. So these are things we looked at some last week, and we'll continue over the next couple weeks. And I just had a couple notes with that. One is when we're going through these things, right, it's kind of the intellectual conversation of how we can know these things rationally, evidentially. I hate the term blind faith, right? I don't believe I have a blind faith. I have a faith that is reasoned, and then there's evidence behind it. But it's more than that, right? Now, for me, there's more than just rational things. There's experiential things. There's things that I've experienced, that's why I believe as I believe. But there's a lot that is carried with that, right? There's emotions and there's just baggage that we may have. Sometimes it's hard to take in certain things and accept certain things, and there can be walls we build and so on, depending on our past, our history. Some people have resentments against the idea of God. They've suffered hurt, they suffered pain. There's things like that fall into this conversation, and it's kind of that reflection of even with the evidence, kind of what other things might be going on inside a person. One presenter I'm very familiar with, he would always ask the question, if I could prove that Christianity was true, would you become a Christian? And the reason he would ask that, it was kind of give a person to reflect, like, if you hear that question and you kind of buckle at it, it's because it's not a matter of proof, it's a matter of like there's something else, there's something kind of emotional, or I don't like that idea. Or I wouldn't really want to become a Christian, even if you could prove it was true. So it kind of gets the idea that it goes beyond just an intellectual thing. So these conversations are dealing with intellectual, evidential matters, but I just want to kind of recognize that it goes deeper than that. And also for us to all kind of reflect on that. The second quick note, because this applies to every week, and that is, right, we're looking at that whole probable answers, right? When we're looking at, again, why things are the way they are, how reality seems to be, how things work, what are the probable answers for these things, and kind of making this cumulative case. So when you put all these things together, what does it seem to suggest maybe is the answer for it? I'm not going to go through the whole illustration, but I talked about a crime scene, right? How you can maybe just have one line of evidence, an eyewitness, but that's not enough to convict somebody. But when you have an eyewitness, and you have DNA, and you have fingerprints, right? And you have just these multiple lines of evidence, then it all really makes the case much clearer. So it's kind of that line of thinking. It's the multiple sectors of evidence that make this cumulative case. So that's what we did last week, right? It was looking at the existence of God. And we saw this, we put that kind of illustration up here with the one that's in the far, I'm going to turn this a little bit. The far corner here, right? That idea there's God and there's all those different arguments that in and of by themselves alone, right? Maybe isn't kind of proof, but with all of them, it really starts to suggest like they all point to a God. God would answer all those arguments if there's a God who exists. Quickly, there's three I really spent time on. Right? There was the cosmological argument, that is, we began. Right? That the universe began. If you want to take a shot at what that one was? Be brave.
There was nothing, then there was something.
There it is, right? And we know the universe, scientifically, right, there's multiple things that we know the universe had a beginning. It's not eternal, it's not static, which means everything that begins had a cause. And that means you have to have something that caused this universe. You have to have something that's outside it, right? A thing can't create itself. So you can't have something within creation that made itself. You have to have something that's outside it, which means you have something that is outside of everything we see, everything we know, right? That's immaterial. That would be something that's eternal, something that is extremely intelligent, right? That is all powerful to make the universe. It's something that is beyond and things that are now hard to get our minds around, right? Because we're talking something that is outside of creation, outside of what we always see and touch. But just logically, you need that because something never comes from nothing. Right? Something always comes, there's always a cause, God being that cause. There was the teleological argument, and these are the technical terms, or the idea that we began, that we were designed. Right? That we see in the universe, all the fine-tuning of the universe, we talked about a few of those things, of just the impossible odds that some of these things would happen by chance, and just literally impossible. That's we're talking the force of gravity, the tilt of the Earth on its axis, the distance of the Earth and the Moon, the size of the Moon, the expansion of the universe, the rate of the expansion is there's like 30 other physics causes in physics that if they're not precisely fine-tuned, there's no life. Right? That idea, and then the idea looks kind of the smaller realm, looks at just our own DNA, what makes us up, and that there's 3 billion letters of code in our DNA that has to be exactly in the exact sequence, right? And if it's not, it doesn't work. And I kind of talked about, I give that illustration of like if you were walking on the seashore and you saw just the word, in this case it was summer, scribbled in the sand of the seashore, you're gonna rightly assume, right, that was an intelligent life and did it. You're not gonna assume that happened by mistake. And that's something as simple as sand in the seashore. So it seems to be beyond reason to think, and there's code in our DNA that is more complex than anything we've ever created, any video game, anything else. And when there's a fine-tuning universe that is impossible to have happened by chance, then you have a designer, you have intelligence, you have something that has to make that is intelligent. You recognize design, you recognize design requires intelligence. So there's that argument, and the final one being the moral argument, which is the argument that we know good from evil. And this is one that's could be a long talk all in itself, but the real gist of it is, in general, from people throughout society, or throughout cultures, throughout history, and even though there's different practices and different things, right? There's a general understanding of certain things that are always wrong and right, with murder, and stealing, and so on. And so sometimes the question, one, where does that come from? And like a blind evolution has a problem describing where these kind of things would come from. And the second being, if there is nothing higher than ourselves, then it's just a matter of opinion. Right? If there isn't a God, or a law needs a lawgiver, is the example I give. Right? If there's nothing greater than ourselves, then you saying something is wrong and me saying it's right, it's just our opinion. Right? The reason I believe some certain things are wrong, the reason I believe genocide, when I see this in certain countries, is wrong, is because these are people created in God's image. And the murder that is happening there is wrong. Right? But the ones committing the genocide would say, no, it's not. That's why they're doing it. So it's either a matter of opinion or there's something greater than us, right, that we're appealing to. So that'd be the moral argument. So I just kind of give you that foundation a little bit, because it really does build on even when we talk tonight, the idea like when we know the weight, the evidence behind God's existence, that this is to me beyond doubt, right? It is beyond doubt. To me, it's more faith to believe God doesn't exist because of the evidence. So when I know that, this applies to some of the other things that we all start talking to tonight. So that's where we're going now. We're going to start talking on this idea of isn't death the end, right? That Jesus exists, because that's what some claim, right? That he didn't exist at all. We even know that he really did. And then if he did the resurrection really happen? Did he do all he said he did, and the resurrection really happened? There's a few things we'll look at. We'll look really, really briefly just at the topic of miracles. And this is where it'll actually kind of apply to the conversation of God's existence. Then we spend a little time on what did the early church believe. We're going to look at an early creed. And then we're going to spend some time looking at the testimony of, or the writings, should I say, of what I call the opponents of Christianity, the enemies, so people who are not Christians, Romans, other Greek philosophers, Jewish historians that were anything but friends of Christianity, who loathed the Christian movement. But they were writing about things that they saw with Christianity. So we'll look at some of that and what that tells us, which I find that really, really fascinating. And then last we'll close on this idea of just the evidence for the death and the burial and the empty tomb and the resurrection. So that's where we're going. So first, miracles. Right? Because that's sometimes the hang-up for people when you start talking about this, is you're talking miracles, where you're talking the Bible in general, you're talking the parting of the Red Sea, and you're talking the plagues, and you're talking all these different miracles. Of course, we're speaking Jesus specifically, you're talking all the healings and so on, but then the resurrection, right? It's a significant miracle. So how can these things happen? Aren't they impossible? And here's where I look to the very thing that we discussed last week. If I know logically, if to me all the things rationally tell me that there has to be a God who created everything, who made everything, including the complexities of beyond anything we can understand, right? Far beyond our greatest scientists, anything we can understand, right? Who made all that, and you think the expanse of the universe, he made all of that, well then, what is it for him to do these miracles, these things we read in the Bible? A resurrection, right? A parting of the Red Sea. But if he made it all, he made everything, including us, including all that 3 billion letters of code in our DNA, and if he made that, then what is it for a God to do any certain miracle? And so once you hit the point, it's kind of where one argument builds on another. You see, when you hit that point, you understand, to me, again, it's more faith to believe there is no God. You see how it's easy to go here, well then that's the biggest miracle of all. That's creation, making all of us, making the universe. I mean, so then working within that creation and parting a Red Sea, that's child's play for the God who made all this. So just the idea of there being miracles possible seems clear. Yes, if there's a creator, there are miracles that are possible. So the next question we might ask is, well, why don't we see them today? For that, I want to offer three separate points. Two of them are kind of related. First one, so saying like, why no Red Seas parting today? Why that kind of thing? We didn't just see the Red Sea parted again. Why aren't these things happening? So first I would say, many of the miracles in the Bible are context specific. So what do I mean? So right, when you're reading these things with the parting of the Red Sea and so on, when you're following the story of the Bible, right, this is God calling a nation to himself, forming a people for himself. And he's bringing them out of slavery. It is a one-time event, right, in we'd say redemptive history, one-time event of what God is doing. Right? He's not calling another people to himself out of slavery to build another nation elsewhere, right? So these events were specific to that event. And they also confirm that Moses was the spokesman for God as he guys working these miracles through him. It's confirming that. Right? And you get that when you get through some of the prophets, and you get that certainly when you get to Jesus, right? These miracles would in fact confirm he is who he says he is, that he is the Son of God, but he's a spokesperson for God, right? He's doing all these miracles. So a lot of these were very context specific, why you wouldn't see them every single day on these type of miracles. Kind of related on that is, sometimes when people hang up on the miracles of the Bible, they feel like, well, I'm reading the Bible, I'm turning these pages, and there's a miracle that feels like on every page in a paragraph. And you can feel like, well, there's miracles happening just left and right. But in reality, when you are kind of following the historical flow of the Bible, many of these things, I mean, they happen in bunches around Moses, and certainly in bunches around Jesus, but many of these things, it would be years, hundreds of years apart. And when you're going from Moses to Elisha, and you're going from some of these other people, there's years, decades, hundreds of years between some of these miracles. So even then, I'm saying some of these things happen because God was doing specific things. If there is huge lengths of times in between them before he's working through another specific prophet and so on. So that sometimes people get the wrong idea that there was just a left and right, everywhere you looked was a miracle then, and why not today? And that wasn't the case even then. The last comment I just want to make on it is that they do still happen today. I don't think the parting of the Red Sea, right? That's what I'm saying. There's some things that are context specific, but there are. And actually, there's a 2-volume book, just as a reference for you here, that is it is quite extensive, as you can see, where this Craig Keener spent years just trying to research and categorize and write of every miracle story he could find, right? And he tried to find ones that were verifiable in some ways, some verifiable through doctors and medical things and so on. And it's been a while since I've read some of it, but I know in the beginning he makes some point of it, saying like, even if something like 5% of the miracles recorded in this book, in these books, there's 2 of these, 2 volumes, even if like 5% are true, we're still talking thousands of miracles that were true. Right? And he's getting, the point is that it seems hard to debunk and say that every single one of these cases was a lie when you're talking thousands and thousands of people all across different nations and cultural contexts and history reporting these things, and to say that they're all false seems pretty hard. So the idea that there is no miracles, like, no, there still are. We don't see them every day. They're not things that are constantly happening right outside our window, but there are, and there might be people here with testimonies as to experiencing something. So that's where we kind of get to miracles, right? They are possible when you have a creator who created everything. There are certain things we don't see today because of the context of why they were happening in the Bible, but there are miracles that do still happen today, that he still works through and with people. So that kind of establishes the groundwork. Miracles really are possible. Right? They'd be cakewalks, right? The one who created everything. So then with that, we kind of go, what then did the early church believe? That idea of, like, was this whole miracles, resurrection, was this a myth that grew over time? Like that is his claims, maybe you believe this, or you've heard people say this, that it was over time, right? Kind of a tall tale thing. Time goes on, other people tell the stories, and it gets bigger and bigger, and the fish that was once this big is soon this big, right? It just grows and grows. And isn't that how things likely went? What did the early church, meaning the first believers, right, at Jesus' time, what did they actually believe? Would they have claimed this stuff to be true? So for that, we're going to look at one of the creeds. Some of you may be familiar with that term, some maybe not. Creeds basically were written stylistically for the purpose of memorization, to capture essential beliefs, core doctrines. And even more so, when you go back into Jesus' time, right, many people then were illiterate. Right? There's I believe only 10% of the population who could read. So when you could write things in a certain way that you could tell people that they were kind of stylistically written, like people could memorize them and have it in their head, right? It's how you helped communicate certain core truths. So that was what a creed is, and how a creed looks. Well, there's the book of 1 Corinthians, which was written by the Apostle Paul in 55 AD. Now, everything we're going to talk about here as we follow this, what's going on in Corinthians, I want to point out that it doesn't matter whether you're talking to a Christian scholar or the biggest atheist New Testament scholar there is. Right? They would all agree on these facts. They would agree that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. Right? There's really no debate on that. Paul wrote this, and then he wrote this about 55 AD. Well, in this, in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 8, is what's known as recognized as one of the first Christian creeds that Paul writes in here. And again, this is kind of universally recognized amongst scholars from every background. But they see it's written in a Greek, stylistically in Greek, to be easily memorizable and to capture these core beliefs. And so I'm going to read these few verses for you to see what this creed is. It says, "For what I delivered to you as of first importance, what I also received." So he delivered, pause, he delivered, so he did past tense, right? He said, I've already delivered this to you. And it's what I first received. I received it beforehand. So he gave it to him before 55 AD when he's writing this. And he'd received it before that. So he's already putting something further back in the past than 55 AD. And then he goes on to say what he received. It is that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures. This is the point being the Old Testament Scriptures, because the New Testament is being written at this point. So that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and then that he appeared to Cephas, which is another name for Peter, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. So he said most are still alive, a few have died. So in other words, these are people who are still here. If you want to go talk with them, 500 people, mostly still alive. Eyewitnesses, go have a chat with them. Then he appeared to James, and to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. So that's the creed idea, right? That's he died for our sins, that he was buried, that he rose 3 days later, and then he appeared to all these different parties. This is memorizable and passed around to all these early believers. So how early was it? Right? We already know that it was prior to 55, right, when Paul was writing 1 Corinthians. Well, we can work our way back here a little bit. We know that Paul was first in Corinth around 50 AD. And we know this because there's actually, he mentions in Romans this person named Erastus. He's a city treasurer. So he mentions Erastus, which you think, well, what does that mean? How does that have anything to do with it at all? Well, kind of one of those wonders of archaeology. Not long ago, 40 years ago, I think, if I remember right, they uncovered this stone. This is from Corinth, ancient Corinth. It's the Erastus stone, and that what that says there is Erastus, in return for his aedileship, paid it at his expense. So this was a road in front of a theater, and they're giving credit to Erastus for the one who paved this road. Right? So he was this governor. That aedileship was an elected Roman magistrate. Right? So he's this treasurer, I should say, the city treasurer that Paul refers to, and they only served for 1 term, 1 year, and that was the year of 50 AD. So that would put Paul there, to put him there in Corinth in 50 AD. It's kind of cool how archaeology kind of comes into this and really helps clarify exactly what time this guy was in Corinth and Paul would have met him. So we know that's when he was first in Corinth. Then when did he still receive the materials before this? The critical consensus, and again, this would be accepted by anybody, Christian, non-Christian alike, any scholar who studies this, would be 35 AD. So let me give the timeline quick. 30 AD is what generally everybody understands as the crucifixion. Right? There's some debate, 30, 32, right? For this, 30 would be the crucifixion. To put 32 AD when Paul's conversion happens, and also not argued, right? And there's enough historical evidence on Paul, not only Paul's existence, but that he was once a person who was brutalized Christianity, tried to arrest and have Christians murdered, Christians killed, right? That he had this conversion experience, and that's pretty clear.
Mark, let me get this straight. Saul was Paul, right?
Yes, he was.
He was convicted of Christian. Then he had his conversion, 32 AD or so.
32 AD, yep.
Okay.
So 2 years after the crucifixion. And then we know in 35 AD, he goes to Jerusalem. And how do we know this? Well, in Galatians, another letter that every Christian or non-Christian scholar alike will tell you was an authentic Paul letter. He definitely wrote this. In Galatians, he's given a little history. And he's speaking about his conversion. And he says after his conversion, he went to Arabia for 3 years. Well, conversion in 32. He goes to Arabia for 3 years. That puts it at 35. And then he spent 15 days. He went to Jerusalem then and spent 15 days with Peter and James, the brother of Jesus. 15 days with Peter and James. Which then seems like that is the most likely time, right, when he is receiving that creed. He's there with them, these brothers in Jerusalem, and receiving this creed, right? That Jesus died, that he rose, that he was buried, that he rose, and then appeared to all these people. So he learns this same creed in 35, which, by the way, he's learning something that's already been passed around. So that means it's already been in existence. And then we just know from Galatians, he speaks about how he goes on his missionary journeys for another 14 years. And then 14 years later, he returns to Jerusalem, and he returns there to confirm that they're still all teaching the same thing. There's nothing that somebody was teaching different. And he talks in Galatians that yes, they were all teaching the exact same gospel, that same thing. He died, he was buried in a tomb, he rose, right? And he appeared to all these people. And he died for our sins, more specifically. So he confirms that, and then we know in 50 AD he's back in Corinth. And that's where he's first giving to them this creed. Right, so we can see this timeline of how it came along. So it means that this timeline shows us that this creed comes from anywhere from a year or two of Jesus' crucifixion. Right, so that means right after Jesus' crucifixion, this is a creed that everybody's memorizing. All the people who are illiterate, right, they're learning this. That Jesus died for our sins, that he was buried, that he arose 3 days later, and that he appeared to multiple people, so in one case like 500 people at one time, so many people to attest. Right, so we're talking a timeline that brings almost to the point of the crucifixion and resurrection, showing when this belief came about. Right? Yes.
Another quick. So Corinth, how close is that? Close to Jerusalem? That's a town, right? Corinth, a town.
It is.
Okay, and the Corinthians, that's the people of Corinth, right?
Yes.
They were believers. They were all different nationalities.
They were mostly Greek. They were not Jewish. Yes, they were different, and probably some different nationalities in there because the Roman province, there's a lot of traveling there. But I don't know if you know offhand, I think Corinth, was that in modern Turkey?
It's got to be close to Jerusalem, right?
Is it in Greece? Greece? Okay. I don't remember where Corinth was. It's in Greece. Thank you. So no, it's not close to Jerusalem. So it'd be in modern Greece now. So it was during one of his missionary journeys, but a place where he'd established a church. So right almost from the beginning, right, this is what they believe, so much so that there's a creed created for everybody to memorize, to be able to speak this to others, right out of the gate. And then just note that there's also other New Testament books, right? All the New Testament books are written from 40 to 90, right? So it's not like any of these books were written well after the fact, right? They're all written, of course, by apostles, by people who walked with Jesus, but written at the time when many other people lived through this time that Jesus was crucified and supposedly resurrected, right? People who would be eyewitnesses to say whether they saw these things or not. Right? So these are beliefs that were right from the get-go, right out of the gate. And I'd even point one other one that's just the early church fathers, and I'm not going to spend tons of time on it, but just one other example. A couple of them would be like Clement of Rome and Ignatius. And these are kind of like the second generation, right? These are after the apostles are dying out. These are the next kind of group here leading the early church. So let me just read what Clement, just to give you one quote. This would have been late 1st century or so, early 2nd century. He says, the apostles received the gospel for us from the Lord Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ was sent forth from God, so then the apostles are from Christ, and Christ is from God. Having been fully assured through the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ, and confirmed in the word of God with full assurance of the Holy Ghost. They appointed their first fruits to be bishops and deacons unto them, that they shall believe. And so it's this quote talking about how they kind of started structuring the church with some deacons and bishops, but this all started coming from the apostles, right, who were from the Lord, right, sent forth by Jesus as apostles, having been fully assured by the resurrection. And so this is all just early, right? Very early evidence. The idea of a myth, the idea of things growing over time, the idea that this is not what they believed from the beginning is just not, it's not viable. It's not legitimate. And I know people claim it, but they don't know this, or don't study it, or don't care, or just don't want to hear it. Because it's right from the beginning. And this is stuff I'm not presenting where this is just the Christian perspective. Every non-Christian scholar would agree with everything I just said here. Now they might not believe there was a resurrection, but they're going to tell you that this is what everybody believed right from the beginning. So what the Christians believed right out of the gate, this creed is right from the beginning. This is what they taught. So, let's see, where's our time here? That's the Christians, right? But again, I know some people will take issue with that. Well, that's all people who did believe, right? Maybe they're biased in some way, and how can they be trustworthy with what they're telling us? Well, there happens to be quite a bit of extra-biblical, is the term, but things that are outside of the Bible, right, writings that talk about these things, that speak of things with Jesus and of the early followers. That gives actually quite a huge amount of information. So these are the opponents of Christianity, again, speaking for the most part. So when you think about it, sometimes they might be saying how they don't believe something, but it tells you what the other people believed, right? Just because they didn't agree with it, it tells you the prominence of what was taught, what is out there, and how it's going. And so we have quite a bit here of what these opponents covered. What do the opponents say? Those who are not Christian. So I'm going to give it, and I'm just giving a summary, kind of an idea of what they mentioned, right? Instead of giving a full quote, otherwise we'd be spending a long time with it. But you have in your notes, you have each person's name and so on. You can certainly go online and start searching and see what they say about Jesus or Christians and so on. And some of these, it might not be tons that they say, but what they say is telling.
So Mark, the opponents are the atheists?
They would be anyone that's like Jewish, right, would be opposed to Christianity, right, that you're worshiping this Jesus character, right? They'd be the Greeks and the Romans, right, who have all their other pantheon of gods and don't want to hear anything about Jesus and think this is insane, right, that there's this man who rose from the dead. So those would be the opponents, right, people who have a very different faith, right, a very different faith and do not agree with this Christian message. But they write about it. So there's Lucian of Samosata, who was a Greek satirist. This is from 160 AD. And in his writing, he just speaks about how Christians consider themselves brothers, right? So they see themselves as family. And this is after they turn from the Greek gods. And they not only turn from the Greek gods, but they turn from them to worship this crucified man from Palestine. So that's how he refers to these Christians that he sees. They become brothers, they turn from the Greek gods, and they worship this crucified man in Palestine. Going back further, we've got this Thales, who we think was a Samaritan historian. He was a historian, his full origin is a little unknown. What he writes is just kind of an interesting note. He speaks about this darkness in Jerusalem. So he's writing 55 AD, but he's referring to when Jesus died, it's 25 years prior to this event. He speaks of this darkness in Jerusalem at Jesus' death, and he just kind of calls it as an eclipse of the sun. It's just been an eclipse. Well, the fascinating thing about that, right, when you are reading, like in Mark, here's the passage. This is at Jesus' crucifixion. It says, and when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. So you have this non-Christian historian is writing how this, he explains it as it was just an eclipse, but it was to testify that there was in fact a darkness over Jerusalem at this time of Christ's death. You know, Celsus was a Greek philosopher. He's a little bit later, he's from 175 AD. He attacks the virgin birth. He thinks that's a ludicrous claim. And then he speaks of all these miracles that Jesus did. And he says that they were just magic learned from Egypt. So again, he doesn't believe it, right? But he's telling us like that this is what the Christians believe, that there was a virgin birth. And that this Jesus worked miracles. Well, according to him, like this miracles he did was just trickery. It was just magic tricks that the guy learned from Egypt. That's kind of how he explains it. There's one known as Marabar Serapion, and I might be murdering that name. He was a Syrian and Stoic philosopher in 70 AD, going back to the same lifespan of all the apostles and all these other believers, right? People who would have been at the crucifixion. He had a little bit more of a positive view. He views Jesus on the level of Socrates and Pythagoras. Actually, he calls him, he's the wise king. But he's writing in 70 AD, which in your history, if you know that at all, that's when the Roman Empire attacked Jerusalem and destroyed Jerusalem. Plundered Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, sent the Jews into exile. And so he's referring to that, and he says he thinks that they're being punished for crucifying Jesus. So he doesn't see Jesus as this Messiah, but he sees him as a wise king, but wise enough apparently that he thinks the Jews are being punished for crucifying him, this being, 35 years, 40 years after the crucifixion event. Tacitus, who's a Roman historian, we have a ton of, he's got all these annals of Roman history. He lived from 56 to 120. And he also had a hatred of Christianity. But in his writing, he confirmed that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate while Tiberius was emperor. Because it lines up with exactly what the Gospels teach, right? That he was crucified under Pontius Pilate while Tiberius was the emperor. And he speaks of how Christians were willing to die horribly for their faith. And he's speaking in 64 AD. He's speaking on these events in 64 AD and all these Christians that are being persecuted, tormented. Some of them used as human torches, dipped in tar and put on poles and lit on fire to be torches throughout the road. So you can see the light of the road by this bodies burning. Right? That's how they killed some of these Christians. And so it's brutal ways. And he speaks about how they were willing to die for their faith. This is in 64 AD, again, well in the lifespan of all the people who were there for the crucifixion and everything thereon after that. And some may be familiar with the name Josephus. He's a very well-known Jewish historian, lived from 37 to 100 AD, so he's born just a few years after the death of Jesus and resurrection. But he speaks of several things in his writings. He speaks of the death of James, Jesus' brother, at the hands of Ananias. So of how James had died. So this would be the Apostle James. This would be James who wrote the Epistle of James. This would have been Jesus' half-brother. So he speaks of the death of James. He speaks again of how Jesus worked wonders and was crucified under Pilate. He doesn't speak like he believes that he's this amazing miracle worker, but that's what people all understood of him, and that he did these things and they weren't unexplainable. That he was crucified under Pilate. And then he speaks of how his followers report that they see him alive, right? That he's appeared to them. So all these followers have reported that they've seen him alive. Josephus records this. And then he kind of expresses this frustration that this Christian group will not die out now. Which actually has a little historical background, because there were other people who kind of claimed this role of Messiah throughout that time frame, right? Rome is the invading force, right, that is oppressing the people. They want this Messiah to rise up and kill Rome. And there's some who kind of rise up and start these little political uprising and claim to be that person. And eventually that rising would be snuffed out, that person would be killed or imprisoned, and then that group would just die out. It would fade away, right? It would be the end of it. So there's multiple people who kind of come along with this title of Messiah, and it's just they're imprisoned, they're killed, everything dies, and they're not heard of again. And yet Josephus complains about how that's not the case here. This group talks about they've seen him alive, and that the group will not die out. It just continues to grow. And then there's my favorite, which is Pliny the Younger. Pliny was a Roman lawyer and a governor. And in 110 AD, he writes a letter to the Emperor Trajan. And that letter, and you don't have to read it all now, and I'm not going to go through it all, but I want you to have it. It's actually on the last page of your notes. It's a full letter that he writes. And he writes to the Emperor Trajan. And what he's writing is he's trying to figure out how to deal with this Christian group, all these different Christians. And he's complaining, and he's killed some. He's trying to get some to recant their faith. He speaks of the torture that he's done to some, and so on. And he's writing to Emperor Trajan to figure out, like, what is the best way to handle this. And what if they recant? Then what do I do to them? And if they don't recant, do I continue to kill them? What do I do? So it's a little lengthy letter as he's discussing this, but in this he just reveals multiple details about Christians and about what they believed and about what was happening at that point in time. And we're gonna hit that here in just a minute. We'll kind of cover everything that all of these writings kind of tell us, and then we'll specifically see what Pliny's letter here tells us. So these are just some of the extra biblical letters, and this is how it looks. Right? If you were to take all of these writings, if you never had the Bible, and I just gave you all of these writings from Celsus and Tacitus and Josephus and Pliny and so on. I said, take all of these, go through their writings, and write for me or compile for me everything you can about Jesus or his followers. What would it tell us about them? So you didn't have the Bible at all. Just tell me what you can get from these opponents, right? These people who do not agree with the Christian faith. Tell me what you can get from it. And these are the things you would learn. You would learn that Jesus lived during the time of Tiberius Caesar, which is what it reports in the Gospels. You learn that they speak of him living this virtuous life. You learn that they claimed he was a wonder worker, that he apparently did all these things. Some just thought it was these things he learned from Egypt, but he did enough things that it was notable that he did all these wonders. You learn that he had a brother named James who was martyred, who was killed. You would learn that he was acclaimed to be the Messiah. Again, these writers aren't saying they thought he was, but all these believers claim that he is the Messiah. You learn that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. You learn, right, there was some unexplained darkness that occurred at the time of his death. Right? We looked at that quote. Right? There was some unexplained darkness. God said it was just an eclipse of the sun, but you learn there was some darkness that happened at his death. You learn that his disciples believed that he rose from the dead, that he appeared to them. That his disciples were willing to die for that belief. That Christianity spread rapidly.
Mark, why was James murdered? Why? Do we know why?
Because of his faith.
Okay.
Yeah, because of his
belief.
practice.
Okay.
Yep, absolutely. You learn his disciples worshiped Jesus as God while denying all other gods. And then this is, and some of this will kind of overlap, but this is specifically what you learn from the letter from Pliny. He speaks of how the Christians gathered on a particular day of the week before dawn to sing hymns as Christ to a God, or to sing hymns to Christ as to a God. Right? So he's describing a church service there. These would gather on a particular day of the week before dawn. I'm not suggesting we switch our service to before dawn. To sing hymns to Christ as to a God. So he speaks of that in that letter. As he's explaining this to the Emperor of Rome, right? The most powerful person on that planet in that time, right? He's explaining this to them. And he says these Christians, they promised not to steal or commit adultery and vowed to pay back money when they owed it. Right? So there's these ethical things that these Christians were all promising, which Pliny just can't understand. Why would you vow to not do these things? You learn that there's a role in the Christian community, in this particular Christian community, where they had that was called a deaconess, and that there were slave women serving in this role. And actually in that letter he speaks of torturing these slave women to get information out of them. It's not a pleasant thing he did with them, but they call them deaconesses. You learn that the Christian associations were comprised of males and females, older and younger, and people from all social classes. Comments on that. It's everywhere, right? It is not just one group of people. It's both genders, all ages, rich and poor, all of them are involved in this thing right now.
What nationality? All nationalities too?
All nationalities, yep. Which is why he's writing, I think he's writing to the emperor, right? It's not because he found 3 Christians and he's saying, I don't know what to do with them. Because there's now so many of them, he's trying to figure out what to do with it. How do I handle these people? They're kind of springing up everywhere. And you learn that Christians were not just found in towns. We saw there, they spread out everywhere. They're in villages, they're in rural areas as well. They're everywhere. He kind of talks about them like they're weeds, right? They're every age, every culture, everything. They're in villages and towns. I can't get away from them. And then he speaks of how many Christians can believe that a true Christian would never recant one's faith, even under torture. And actually, if you read that letter, you'll see he's talking about that, like how that was a way he would try to get people to recant. It would be not they torture, but telling them like they needed to recant Christ, but then speak about that Caesar was the Lord and so on, right? But if they when some did do it, he speaks about someone recant, but many wouldn't, right? And that's kind of his test on that. Yes.
So on your point 14, when you were talking about the women and being a deaconess, so in the old church it sounds more like a slave thing as a negative kind of position, where today in a church, if you're a deaconess, it's a position of serving and like offering yourself to God in your church.
No, I'm sorry. No, what he was complaining about is that, like, even somebody as low as a slave woman was serving in this position of deaconess. So, yeah, it was kind of serving in this role. Someone who would just be the lowly of society is serving in these positions in the church, which you wouldn't have in Rome. So yeah, it wasn't like the church called them slaves. It was that he's, I mean, there were slave women, but they served in these roles of authority in the church.
So the Christians' enemies were who? The Romans? Who was convicting the Christians?
Well, you can have many people, but yes, your predominant groups there was the Romans, and that involved Greeks, Greco-Romans, right? Greeks and Romans, and Jewish people. Now, Romans, that was the empire. That was what was in power. So that's going to be a predominant group that is doing the persecution. So like when I mentioned the human torches and all that, that's all coming from Rome, who's doing all this persecution, right? So this is Pliny. He's a governor, a Roman governor, writing to Trajan, about these things, and he's speaking of the torture he would do, right? So that's coming from Rome. So that would be a lot of it, because even though you would get some from some of the Jewish people, they weren't in power, especially once 70 AD happened and Jerusalem was destroyed. Now they're just scattered all over the place. So your power after 70 AD is really Rome, and that would be your opponents. So that's what we have, right? The 17 things. 17 things that we learn, right? Which is like central things from the gospel, right? The central things that you learn in the gospel that you wouldn't even need to learn that from these opponents, right? That he lived, he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, that they saw him, he rose from the dead, they worshipped him as a god, that they said he came to him, that they considered each other as brothers and sisters in the Lord. Right? All of these things, right? You learn from those who are opponents of the faith.
Mark, it almost sounds like you guys were writing the Apostles' Creed.
Yes, that's really good. They kind of were. They probably didn't think they were, but to me, the most fascinating thing of it all, then, when you consider all this writing, all these things, and they're complaining about it. If you were to read some of these actual writings, they're complaining about Christians. They're not speaking highly of it. But what we don't have, all these writings, what we don't have is any ancient source, anywhere, of any kind, from any opposition, that claims that Jesus didn't exist or that's refuting any of these central claims. Right? And again, they will say they don't believe that he's resurrected, but they're not refuting, and they're like, the guy didn't, here's the tomb, here's his body, here's where it is. Right? They're not refuting, this guy didn't even exist. There's nothing So for all these opponents, there's plenty of chances to refute certain claims. There's none, right? And it's not like we haven't found plenty of historical documentation as the names I've listed. Right? So from what they write, it tells us an immense amount about the early Christians. Which means no myth, right? There's no myth, there's no time for any myth to raise, right? First Creed coming within a year or two of Jesus' death and resurrection. Right? This is what's being practiced, this is what's being preached, this is what's being spread everywhere. And from there it goes like wildfire. So much so that a Roman governor finally has to write the emperor and say, these people are everywhere, they're spreading out, they're in towns, they're in cities, they're in villages, they're old, they're young, they're rich, they're poor. How can I kill them? What can I do with them? Right? So that is not a myth, right? There's no question. So any scholar who studies this, right, there's no question of Jesus' existence. Did he live? Did he die? Right? Or was he crucified? Right? It is outside of the biblical evidence. There's so much that it's pretty indisputable. So there's no time for myth. There's no like this. The fish grew bigger and bigger. This is what the story was from day one. This man died. He was buried for 3 days. He rose, and then he appeared to many. So that's the central facts, right? There was a dead body, that body was buried, and then they all saw somebody. Supposed to say they, not there. They all saw somebody, right? The central facts. So the first fact, that's what I kind of want to work through as we work through this. Jesus was dead. I won't spend much time on because again, that's I think what is pretty verifiable with what we covered. I kind of have an awesome write down here, much like we did with the existence of God. Right, the idea that Jesus was dead. You've got the idea that there's all the writings from the Christians speaking of this.
Mark, we can't see it. She writes way too small. Read it off.
I'll cover it for you. That's all right. Just to give you an idea. It's on your paper. So if you got your notes, flip your notes to page whatever it is, 5, and you've got it all right there.
That is big for her.
Yeah, that's huge for her. But just to give you a visual. So thank you, Austin, for writing. But just to give you a visual. So yes, look on your paper, you can see that. This is to give you kind of a visual. This is the cumulative evidence kind of visual, right? There's Christian writings, right, that all attesting to his death, right? There's all the non-Christian writings that we just talked about. Speaking about this fact, he died crucified under Pontius Pilate. Right? There's no writings to the contrary, nothing contradicting this. And then just simply the fact that Roman crucifixions were thorough. Right? It wasn't, you don't walk away from that. So not only was it customary, they did this flogging, which you refer to as the near death, right? That you're flogged brutally, so you're already near death before you're even hung on a cross. Then you're hung on a cross, right, with nails to your hands and feet, where you would eventually die of asphyxiation, naked under the sun beating on you, right? And then the Romans would practice to make sure, right, you had Roman guards there who are going to do their job because they're at the risk of death if they don't do their job. Right? They're going to make sure that person is dead in the end. Right? So there's bodies that have been found, right, with crucified people with heads smashed in and stabbed and just some brutal things, right? It's the Romans confirming this guy is dead. We read in the Gospels, right, that one of the centurions stabs Jesus in the side so deeply that water and blood pours from his heart. Pours from his side, which I'm no medical doctor. We can speak from my understanding is since he went deep enough with the sword that it would pierce some sac, something in the heart, that the blood and the water is running out from there. So there was a sword pierced right through into his heart, right? Which again was the common Roman practice, making sure this victim was dead. There's no chance of life.
Quote Princess Bride, he wasn't mostly dead.
Who's dead? I should have had the Princess Bride quote in here. I feel like I missed out. Yes, right. So they were very thorough. So there's just no question, right? He was dead. Yeah, yes, he was dead. So that's the first fact. Well, then what's the next? That he was buried. Right. That's the creed. That he was then buried for 3 days. Well, with that, there's several things. Again, I just point out that creed of 1 Corinthians 15, right, from a year or two after that, his crucifixion, maybe before that, but at least we can go back to then, to speak of that fact, he was buried. Right, there's no conflicting story about any other thing, about any other burial. And then a few other facts with that. The Sanhedrin, which was the ruling authority there in Jerusalem, right, the ones that were responsible for having him crucified, they were responsible for having the person they condemned buried for the purposes of purity for the temple and Jerusalem and the land and so on. So they would make sure that the body was buried and not just hung out there or thrown on a road or whatever. And this also fits with some Roman custom that Romans would allow Jews to bury their dead according to their customs in order to keep the peace. I know there's also been archaeological evidence of some bodies found in tombs that were crucified bodies. Like they would know because they'd find the body and there was still nail spikes sticking through the foot, the heel, the ankle bones, and so on. So crucified victims in these tombs. So that was a practice that happened. The Romans let them bury them in tombs. And that Jewish authorities, right, they wanted him dead. They wanted this for a long time. They would have paid attention to what happened to his body. Right? They wouldn't have been known, been ignorant to where it went. Right? They would have known it was in fact buried for the purity issues alone, but plus because they loathed this guy and wanted him dead, they're going to know where the body goes. And then lastly, if you're reading the Gospels, you read how this man, Joseph of Arimathea, who was part of the Jewish council, comes and asks to take Jesus' body down and prepare it and bury it in his tomb. Well, again, this is a member of the Jewish council, the people who were responsible for crucifying Jesus. I don't know on Joseph of Arimathea, he might have been opposed to that. I don't know what his faith was or wasn't. But if you're making this story up, and if you're somebody who's inventing this, you're not going to make someone who's an opponent of you, someone who loathed you and loathed Jesus, you're not going to make them the hero of the story who comes and takes Jesus' body down and offers the tomb for him. So it just speaks, right? That's not a detail you make up. It speaks to the validity of the account. So again, those are all listed in your notes, but the reason that Austin's writing all that is just all these cumulative things, right? When you put them all together, that fits, right? He was buried, right? So that's the claim. He was dead. He was buried. And then there was an empty tomb, right? That the tomb was empty. Well, it's multiple lines of evidence for that too. It's cumulative evidence. So what would point to the tomb being empty? Several things. Well, the first is that all four Gospels report that women were the first there to the tomb. The first ones there to see the tomb. The stone was rolled away. There was no body, and this angelic encounter, right, that he was not there. Right? All four Gospels report that. Now, there's some varying details, which we'll actually speak of, but all four report that. Now, today, that wouldn't mean a thing. That would be a meaningless detail. It wouldn't matter if we said it was women who saw it first or men who saw it first. It wouldn't matter at all. But in first century Judaism, it means a ton, because in that culture, a woman's testimony was kind of worthless, untrustworthy. Right? Couldn't trust what she was going to say. So again, if you're going to make up a detail, you're going to make up this story, and you're going to say that this Jesus rose, there's an empty tomb, you're not going to make up the first people to see it were the most untrustworthy sources in your culture. Right? You're not going to create that detail out of thin air. Right? If you're going to make this story up, you're going to have it be somebody who would be a witness that people would believe and so on. This kind of authoritative witness. Right? The only reason you would include this detail is because it is true. It's the true detail. Right? It is these women who were the followers of Jesus, who've been with him for much of his ministry, were the first ones there to see the empty tomb. First ones there to speak to the angel and so on. Right? It's written in all four because that is true. But it's only a detail you would include if it was true, not if you were making it up. Second, right? This is just kind of a quick reference to that creed again. This is what the early church preached. Right away, the tomb was empty, which And it's worth just pointing out, right, this is in Jerusalem, right? The tomb is in Jerusalem, where all the people who hated Jesus, crucified him were. And they're running around shouting about an empty tomb, right? Right there in that first century creed. The tomb is empty. Well, if you're an opponent of Jesus, you're just going over to that tomb with the stone in front of it, so here's that body right here. Right? But they're preaching this right from the beginning. The tomb is empty. Another line of evidence. There's, from this time frame, so during Jesus' time, there's at least 50 tombs that we've known of that have served as religious sites where they've been venerated, meaning people go to, pay homage to it. They go to that tomb. And you can even think of things in today's society, right, where we would go to a grave of somebody or whatever that would, somebody that we really respect or whatever. Or there's certain religious things, right? We'd go on this it's all venerated, right? And there was 50 such tombs that we're aware of in Jesus' day. So it's not like that wasn't a practice. And yet, that was not the case with Jesus' tomb. Right? He had all these followers. Again, that's a fact that Christian and non-Christian scholar alike will agree. All these followers. If he was dead in that tomb, then that tomb's going to be venerated. Right? There's going to be people there constantly, right, of his followers. This veneration on his tomb. That was not the case. There was no venerated tomb for him. No evidence of it whatsoever. And then the Jewish response assumes an empty tomb. So this is from Matthew. Right? This is speaking about, right, after the stone was rolled away and Jesus is no longer there, and the guards go back to the Roman authorities. It says, so some of the guard went into the city, and they told the chief priests all that had taken place. And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, the elders gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, tell people, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. So they took the money and did as they were directed. And the story has been spread among the Jews to this day. So again, for a skeptic could say, well, this is out of the Bible. What does that mean? Again, there is nothing else of all the other documentation we have disputing this story. Right, this is the early story right away. Right? First creed, early creed, right away. The tomb is empty. The early church is preaching this. They're saying it's empty. There's a story that the gospel writer is saying that the Roman officials had just paid the soldiers to say they stole the body. Nothing else refutes this story. Right? If the body's there, right, again, they're just going to grab that body and just, right, they're just fine with being brutal. Right? They can drag that body all around town. Right? They're no problem proving that body is there, that tomb is not empty. But there's nothing of that, no writing of that, no evidence of that. All we have is this story that they spread that it was the disciples stole the body. Which means that you don't spread that story unless the tomb is, in fact, empty.
Mark, question.
Yes?
If the soldiers said that they fell asleep on duty, wouldn't they have gotten in big trouble?
Yes. They would have, absolutely. Which is where he's saying that Matthew quote, like he'll pay how do you say who he's paying to keep people off their back.
A sufficient sum of money was enough money to keep them quiet, even over losing their lives possibly for falling asleep.
Yes, I think because that goes to kind of show the validity of the count again. Right? Instead of killing the soldiers, I'd rather have you spread the news that they just stole the body before we have all this other uproar about what happened in the body. So I'll keep you alive, you just give them this story. Which, hey, if you're going to keep me alive, sure, I'll spread that story, I'm sure they were all for it. So again, there are multiple lines of evidence that says there was no body. There was no body in that tomb. Of course, doesn't a resurrection make, but it does mean we have an empty tomb. We have a dead body, and we have a body that was buried in a tomb, and now we have a tomb that's empty, and no one can seem to present it anywhere, especially the opponents who would have loved to have done that. But then, how do we know it's a resurrection? And I think there's some very, very, for me, again, some very convincing things. First one, lives and social structures for many people inexplicably changed. And even some of these non-Christian writings, like the Pliny the Younger letter I gave you, it talks about, they're living very, very different lives. Now that might not seem as much to us today because a lot of times, depending, but for a lot of us, someone becoming a Christian isn't much risk. But here, you're either, if you're Jewish, right, not only are you at risk of persecution, but you're going to be ostracized from families, the temple life, everything that you did. Religion wasn't just a thing they did on a Sunday morning, right? It wasn't it was woven into their life. And everything they did, right, had religious implications. And so they would be removed from all that, right? And this happened. And then, of course, if you're Roman, now you're not worshiping all these Roman gods, and you're not paying homage to Caesar as Lord, and so on. And that's going to cause multiple problems for you. So it's not just a simple thing like, they just believe something different like today, and it's no harm, no foul. Right? Their social structures change, so much so, that there's letters written by non-Christians talking about how it's spreading all over the place. I don't know how to deal with this. It's spreading everywhere, and their lives are drastically different. Again, this is at a time, right? This isn't happening 300 years after the fact, 500 years, right? That may be a different story. This is happening at a time, right, when everybody would have been alive at the time of his crucifixion and resurrection, if he had resurrected, right? So everybody would have been alive to know, are these stories true? I can verify things. I can go. He supposedly appeared to 500 people. Right? He appeared to all these apostles. Right? Even if I'm not one of those 500, I can sort of verify a lot of these things. Right? It was at the time of the lifespan of these people. And yet all these people's lives are changing. The social structures are changing inexplicably. You don't do that unless there's something that absolutely convinces you to the core that this person is something very different than any other person. Right? And I don't know what does that other than that this person just came out of the grave and is talking to you. Right? That's what changes social structures inexplicably, right, to people. In the comments, I mentioned right that the early church would not be defeated. Again, significant. There was many different movements at that time. Many of them, all squashed, all died. And yet this one wouldn't die. And again, that adds significant persecution. Right? At the very least, you're ostracized from your families and your way of life. Everybody knew your community. At the worst case, right, you're becoming a human torch, or you're thrown into the wild animals to be torn by animals. But you don't do that unless you really believe. But also, usually a movement is going to die out when they start seeing that happen. And unless you have something that convinces you that even if I'm going to die by being a human torch, I'm going to die that way then because I saw a resurrected man speak to me. Right? That changes things. Which kind of goes through the early martyrs. Who dies for what they know is false? Right? So if I were to die for my faith now, all that would tell anybody is that I really believed it to be true. But it wouldn't have any kind of evidential weight on did it really happen. Right? No more than a Muslim who dies for his faith would have any evidential weight of it really happening. We just say they really believed it happened. But again, these are people who were alive at the time that this resurrection was to happen. Right? And some of these, right, that we know, some of the apostles that died brutally. Right? We know that Peter was martyred, that Paul was martyred, and so on, right? These apostles, Paul was martyred. Right? And many other believers at that time. Right? People that would have known if it was false. And so if you know it's false, so let's just take one of the apostles. You're Peter. You know it's false. You're making it up. For whatever the motivation, leave that aside. You're making it up. I'm going to tell you that this guy resurrected, so we should follow him. Well, now they're going to crucify you. Well, at least as the tradition has, he was crucified upside down. Right? They're going to crucify you upside down, and I'm sure brutally tortured prior to that. How long are you sticking to the story that you made up this guy was resurrected? Right? When you know it's false. Right? It's a very different thing You're talking people who are dying for something that they would have known was false. And and if it was one person, you could say, well, maybe it was just a crazy guy. But right, multiple people. As far as best as we know, like all, or most of the disciples, most of the apostles, many of the early followers, James, the brother of Jesus, right, that all died brutally for what they would have known to be false if they were making it up. It makes no sense. No one does that. No one. One crazy person maybe, not many. Not many. Right? The only reason you would do that is you really believe you saw this risen man. Or you believe he rose from the dead. Then you're going to be willing to die brutally because of your faith. Right? Then when somebody like Pliny, who's writing and talking about the torture he could do, then you maybe don't recant because you have every reason to believe it was true because you saw it, or you are close with people who did see it, right? Where you know it's true. Then you are willing to die for it. But not when you know it's false, and we're all in that position to know if it was false. So those early martyrs bear a significant testimony to the validity that something happened significant, that they were going to die brutally for what they said to happen, the resurrection. And the last one pointed out is Paul's conversion. Thing, as we're talking to Bill, right? He was this opponent. He was Saul. And every secular historian will tell you too, right? Not only that he lived, that he was this very intelligent, well-trained Jewish and Greek. He was trained in all the Greek philosophers as well, right? This brilliant man, well-trained man, who blows Christianity so much that he is going out and persecuting those and trying to arrest those who are followers of Christ and have them convicted, have them killed. Right? That was his life. That is not disputed amongst any scholars. Well, then suddenly he has a complete about face. Something wholly different. His life is completely changed to the point where he's the one who is being persecuted by other people and sought, and eventually is martyred for his faith. Because he claims he saw the risen Lord. Why would anybody, and this is a brilliant man, and it comes out in his works, right? He is a brilliant person. What would cause him to do that? And to say it was, I saw the resurrected Lord, right? That's his claim. Other than if he saw the resurrected Lord. So we kind of put it together with the resurrection. We have early eyewitness sources, right? Early eyewitness testimony. These stories could have been confirmed. We have an empty tomb, right? Again, could have been confirmed, could have been shown to be not empty. We have no other ancient sources that are offering any other explanation to these things. And we've got plenty of other ancient sources that really just give us a better picture of the validity of Jesus and his followers. We have a resolute early church that would not die in spite of all the persecution. Right? We have the lives of the followers after the resurrection changed completely in spite of everything they had to sacrifice in order for that change. And then we have the death of many of those followers, brutal deaths, right? When they're in a place where they could have known if that was true or false. We have all of that, which really seems to put it that kind of cumulative case, right, that we have a resurrection. Now again, some people complain, well, that's a miracle. I want to go back to the beginning. If you've got a creator, it's that first argument. If you know there's somebody who can create everything, right, then that's not beyond anything that he can do. And then you look at all the other things that testify to this. What explains all these people's lives changed? Everything's changing. What explains the persecution and no one recanting? What explains some of these things? The inability to produce a body. Better than a resurrection. And I can tell you, I've studied a lot. I've listened to a lot of the counter arguments and so on. There's plenty out there, and people are going to believe what they want. But I don't find any of the counter arguments all that convincing. I used to be kind of afraid sometimes. I listen to some of the counter arguments and I think, am I going to hear things like, oh no, I don't know, and that's a good one. I don't know how to explain that. And now I've listened to, over years, I've listened to hours and hours of the experts' counter arguments, and I find them pretty weak myself. That's me, of course, they believe it. But to me, there's only one thing that explains this stuff, and that is the resurrection. Is there a question over there?
No.
Oh, I'm sorry, that's me.
Over there.
Okay.
No, you go first.
No, I don't have a
I mean, this event, it's the most historic event in the history of mankind. He conquered death,
Everything's changed since then.
right?
Yeah,
That's hope for us, life after
absolutely.
death.
Which is actually what I want to close on. So what does it mean if you did? Which is why I think so many people are kind of opposed to it. And to kind of give a good illustration of that, I want to just bring us here for a minute, like if it were happening now. So for the sake of this, for the moment, we're like 10 BC people. Like we're people who lived 10 years before Jesus came into the scene, right? There's never heard of this Jesus, never heard of anything. Our knowledge for right now, everybody in this room, the only knowledge we have is we believe there's 8 gods. Some of us believe there's multiple gods. Some believe in 8 God, right? We have these different kind of spiritual beliefs. And we kind of tell that the world is pretty messed up. There's a lot of brokenness going on. There's terrible things everywhere. That's what we know. And I'm gonna say, I come onto the scene, and I start saying things to you that are like, seem pretty crazy, right? That's kind of, I am the Son of God, that no one gets to the Father but through me, right? That I equate myself with God, that if you've seen me, you've seen God, you've seen the Father. I'm saying things that are pretty, which is what the Jews hated, and they called it blasphemous, right? He's equating himself with God. So I'm saying these things, and then I'm also claiming things like, you have to follow me. And I say things like, if you love me, you will obey my commands. Right? And I'm making some pretty heavy ethical claims, right? I'm not only saying don't commit adultery, I'm saying if you look at a woman or a man, right, with lust in your eyes, you've committed adultery. I'm not only saying don't murder, I'm saying if you hate somebody in your heart, you've basically committed murder and you're worthy of hell. And I'm saying some pretty harsh things that you consider very judgmental, right? And so I'm making all these claims. But amongst it all, I'm also doing I'm healing some people. I'm helping the blind see and the lame walk and so on. So there'd be some of you, maybe you'd say, like this one guy, right? It's magic he learned from Egypt, whatever, it's bunk. And there's gonna be some of you who think, I don't know, this guy's making some wild statements, but he seems to be really genuine. And he's doing these healings and they seem to be legitimate. That seems to testify to who he is. I'm not sure. It's, I might follow this guy because of what he's saying, but these are some pretty bold claims. And I'm supposed to follow him, and it's only by following him that I can go to heaven at all. That's a bold claim. Right? So I'm making this claim. There's people who, of course, have plenty of doubt. And then the enemies, right, because I would create them, right? The enemies arrest me, they beat me beyond belief. Right? And they kill me brutally, and so they crucify me, they hang me on a tree. I'm put in a tomb. And you're going to be thinking, all right, at that point, I'm not exactly sure what to believe with this guy, what it all means. But then all of a sudden, 3 days later, here I am. Right? And I am here in front of you, looking just like this, although I have wounds in my hands and feet and inside. Not bloody and bleeding everywhere, but just the wounds that testify to the fact that I did die I suffered that way and died. But I'm standing here in front of you after all that. Like the Princess Bride. I was dead. And now I'm standing here 3 days later. I don't know what else you start to think other than this guy is legit. Right? Which is why you start to see all those things happen. All those lives change. People switch completely around, different lifestyles, even though they're being ostracized, right? Because the resurrection then starts to verify everything, right? It's one thing if I'm saying, you can't get to God but through me. You might think I'm crazy, but then I'm beaten, tortured, and dead, and then I'm walking around 3 days later fine. Well, that seems to add a lot of validity to what I just said, right? So the resurrection preaches on Easter, right? It changes everything. And it is everything. Because once he's alive, it says that everything he was teaching really seems to hold true. Right? That he is the way, the truth, and the life. That this is only through him. Right? If he's making these claims and he comes back from the dead, well, that means when he says, if you love me, you obey my commands, right? Then that means something. There's a lot of weight. There's a lot of us for us to consider, which is why a lot of people don't like to consider this stuff. And then, of course, beyond that, as you alluded to, Bill, right? It means everything he promised about eternal life and life beyond here and so on, all is true and has validity, because the guy who rose from the grave has some authority to talk about such a thing. Right, so it changes everything. So much hinges on this, right? It hinges on the resurrection. But again, this is just me, right? And there's many reasons I believe this stuff. That some of it is experiential. It's just stuff I've experienced and why I would believe it, that people could believe my testimony or not. But then there's stuff like this. It's like, I can't explain all that away, right? I can't explain all that away other than there was a resurrected man who changed all these people's lives right there on the spot, right there in first century Jerusalem, when it meant persecution and it meant death if they didn't recant, and yet they died in that way. Right? And that testifies a lot, right, to the validity of this resurrection, and then what it means for us that this man did rise, even today then, right? Because those very same words that, if you love me, you obey my commands, those, I am the way and the truth of the life, right? That's still just as valid today, right? Because he rose from the dead. It means he's still alive today. So it's all on the resurrection, and it is not just a blind faith. There's much that points to it, even from all the opponents, that tells us so much about him, and the fact that he existed, he lived. There was an empty tomb that he rose. To me, that's pretty convincing. So next week, we'll look, right, then what's the source of a lot of this? That's the scriptures. It's the Bible. Right? There's things we learn from some of the extra-biblical evidence, but there's, right, most of the testimony about God and what he's doing is all from the Bible. Right? So kind of the idea, and how do we know that everything that they wrote is true? How do we know that we have it? How do we know that they didn't make some things up, they didn't fabricate some things? Right? That idea, how can we really trust these scriptures that give us a far more complete picture of who Jesus is, what God was doing, and all that? So that's where we go. That's where we go next week. Any questions?
Next week, dinner, burgers, and sides, I guess. If you come a little early, just help yourself, just start eating. No wait, maybe we get things going then. What do you think, Mark?
That's right.
Sound good?
Yeah, that's fine. Yep. Any other questions?
Tell your friends, family.
That too. It'd be great to see you more here.
Bring some more Livy people over.
All right.